Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Welcome to the show. This week, two men who have been thinking, writing, and speaking about capitalism for many years. David Harvey is a widely cited author of, among other things, A Companion's Guide to Marx's Capital. Gar Alperovitz is the author most recently of What Then Must We Do?, in which he lays out proposals for democratizing wealth and building an alternative economy. Unless you happen to be one of those who thinks our current economy is doing great and all is hunky-dory in the world of work and money and human relations, you'll have a good idea by now why I've invited these two to talk. With me, with each other, and with you. We're in for something very special. David, Gar, there's so much to discuss with both of you, from capital to labor to work and human relations. But why don't we start by trying to paint a picture of where we are right now? How would you describe, David, the situation in which we find ourselves, economically, maybe humanly speaking?
I think we're at an inflection point in the history of capitalism. Capitalism's what, 200 years old, maybe a little bit more, and it can't be another 200 years of this.
Why not?
And partly because of the rate of growth which is required, this exponential growth rate which goes up and up and up, and of course within it what we see is more and more pressing environmental problems, more and more problems of social inequality, tremendous kinds of difficulties of redistributing wealth, and the political system is completely out of whack and completely purchased by big money power. So, something's got to give, and I think that there's a lot of bubbling going on in the grassroots almost everywhere in the world, saying this system cannot last, and I think the question then is, what's going to replace it and how?
I would put it this way. I think the American system is truly reaching, when you say at the end of the system, that's decades on the table when you say that. But I think in the 19th century, basically they ran the system by taking over the continent and killing whoever got in their way, and when they had any great difficulties, land was what run. In the 20th century, the system was stabilized, I don't think by plan, but it was in fact stabilized in the first quarter of the century by World War I, in the second quarter by World War II, the third quarter by the Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, etc. The defense budget's running down to 3% of the economy, and they're running out of war as stabilizers. So I think the system is in decay and stalemate. It can get very nasty. The question is being posed, where does this all go, and how do we begin talking about different systemic possibilities?
Well, I guess that gets me to my question of, is capitalism the problem, or just our U.S. extreme version of it? Gar?
But I think we're talking about capitalism. I mean, that's the nature of the expanding system in all these cases. And I think also the question, the traditional models that have been offered to deal with, if you don't like capitalism, what do you want? The state socialist model is in disregard, and lots of reasons about it in terms of what happened with the Soviet Union and the invasions and the wars. But also there is not an alternative conception of where we really want to go that's fleshed out and talked about. And I think we're on the phase of having a discussion about that. If you don't like corporate capitalism, you don't like state socialism, and we need an answer. How do we begin talking seriously about the next system? And David's written about that in the last book, and I've written about it. I think we've got to have that conversation now. It's really ripe.
Yeah, I think in the 1930s, for example, there was an alternative capitalism which could be invented, which was largely social democratic, state-managed, and partly based also, of course, on war and the like. That ran into crisis at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, and another capitalism was invented, which we often refer to as neoliberal capitalism, and everything gets privatized, everything gets commodified, we start to dismantle the welfare state and all the rest of it. So we've gone that path. But there's no alternative form of capitalism right now, and I think what is striking about this crisis, which has been brewing for a long time but broke out but really badly in 2008, is nobody's got a real clear answer to where to go right now, which suggests to me that the time is ripe to say, well, maybe we should go outside of capitalism and talk about some alternative system.
At the heart of that social democratic model, or liberalism in the United States, holding it together, in addition to the war that stimulated the economy, was the labor movement, traditional labor movement, and that's disintegrated. You don't get social democracy or liberalism without a reasonably strong labor movement. It's gone from 34% of the labor force organized in the early 50s to 11%, 6% in the private sector.
That's right.
Any model that gets us beyond capitalism is going to be changing and socializing ownership of capital. That's the name of the game. And the question is, how do you do that in a way that is somehow not statist, that produces a humane vision, that is productive, that is ecologically sensible, that is defending of liberty rather than oppressing liberty? And it's time for a really powerful discussion and experimentation of that kind. We are seeing, cooperatives and worker-owned companies experimenting. We're seeing more complex city-owned national kind of municipalizations in Boulder. We're seeing experiments in Cleveland where it's neighborhood-wide ownership structures that incorporate worker participation. So we're seeing experimentation with alternative forms or state public banks. But these are all preliminaries that begin to suggest some of the possibilities that a theoretical model, which we can talk about if you'd like, might ultimately involve.
What do you think, David?
I think, I mean, I like a lot of the experimentation that's going on. It's great. But the problem I have with it is that people are often thinking about remedies for poverty or remedies for social distress. I think we should be actually trying to think about how to appropriate the wealth that has been appropriated from us. There is immense wealth out there, which is concentrated in a very, very small group of the population. It has assembled that wealth over the last 30 or 40 years incredibly powerfully. And I kind of think everybody who's working in an anti-poverty organization ought to join an anti-wealth organization and actually let us take back that wealth which has been taken from us and somehow or other redistribute it, because I think there's plenty of wealth to go around where everybody could have a decent life and a decent living environment. But right now we can't, because certain people have billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they did very well, by the way, out of this last crisis. All the data show that these guys came out of the crisis very fast, and actually some of them doubled or tripled their wealth in 3 or 4 years since the crisis, while everybody else has done very badly. So when we kind of say the system is in crisis, it's not in crisis for them. The top 1% has come out of it extremely well. They're doing very well. They are very successful, and the rest of us are doing very badly.
So it's not in crisis enough.
No.
Well, that goes to the question of, are we struggling in the right places? History, as you've written, of movements, and you just talked about the labor movement, has led us to fight in the place of work, workplace struggles around hours and wages and promotion and control. You could look at cooperatives as another experiment on that front. But where else could this change work be happening? And is it wrong to be still focusing on the workplace?
The trouble right now is we're not necessarily focusing on the workplace, and I don't think we should be necessarily focusing on the workplace. I actually think if you look at all of the unrest that's burst out, for instance in Brazil just recently, or you look at what happened in Turkey in Gezi Park and all the rest of it, what was it about? It was about the qualities of urban life. Okay? So it's not simply about the factory and the workplace, it's about the qualities of urban living. And actually there were a lot of revolutionary uprisings which have occurred over the last 20 or 30 years have been really, to me, urban rebellions. Interesting echoes of the 1960s. They've been urban rebellions rather than simply focused on the workplace. And I think we should take those urban rebellions very seriously and say people want an alternative form of urbanization. They want decent housing and a decent living environment, and those questions are absolutely crucial, as well as the traditional questions that the left has looked at, which is organizing in the workplace.
We haven't had it in the United States. We haven't had the kind of uprisings that you're talking about. So we haven't seen that yet. And when we had it last time, there wasn't any content. People uprose. There was not a sense of where to go with it. So I think we've got to begin to develop what the models are, and again, where does that take us?
Yeah, part of my problem is we're not even thinking about it. It's systematically enough.
Well, where do you see shifts happening? I mean, I will say that one of the great contributions of the women's movement, of the feminist movement, was to say that the realm of the personal is political. It's been women over here who've been saying, actually, while you guys are just focusing on the workplace, the home and the quality of life that we're living outside of the factory deserves another look. Hope there, maybe, in the organizing of women workers and home care workers and mothers and teachers and all the rest.
And not only there, I mean, there were a group, and there still are a group of feminist city planners I mean, you know, the way in which capital is organized now, you put the suburb here, you split people over here, the man goes away or the woman goes away, who's going to take care of the kids? It's all isolated. The reconstruction, literally, of the design of the city becomes part and parcel of what we need to talk about.
Less separation between the paid work and the, at the moment, still unpaid.
There's wonderful work that has been done by women city planners to say the non-sexist city. What does it actually look like that would actually build community? And then how do we, I think there is a critical aspect because we've got to somehow begin to put these pieces together as a coherent dialogue. We were talking earlier about it's time to have this conversation.
Yes.
We've talked about Murray Bookchin's work or other people who started with laying out a conception that begins to fulfill these values that is neither the worker-owned model narrowly or the state-owned model, that actually begins to emphasize these values and provide structural base for it. That's,
I mean,
that's
you
on the table.
two both have in common something else, which is that you talk about networks, about community systems, you talk about communes and territories, I think, in your most recent book.
Yeah, I think territorial organization is very, very significant.
And what do you mean by that, really?
Well, I mean, there are a number of things. I mean, for example, if you want to start thinking about environmental questions, you really have to start to think in terms of bioregions and things like this, which is as self-sufficient as possible in terms of its metabolic relation to the world around it, in terms of food supplies, in terms of, which isn't to say that you just want to imagine that the solution can be entirely local. I mean, we're never going to be able to grow coffee in New York City, and I like my coffee, you know. So we don't want to give up those things, but we can start thinking about, you know, trading relations between bioregions and the like in such a way that actually it's much more environmentally friendly. And we don't then do silly things like import water from Fiji or something like that.
I like what you just said. If you begin at that level, either at the citywide or the region, and the region's critical in all this, then it becomes how do you stabilize the region? So you move up to the scale. So you have to get to the planning problem and to the state problem. But if you start in terms of territorial questions, I think you're at a good starting place.
You, in your most recent book, talk about the contradictions of capital. You talk about ownership, expanding ownership of capital, but can we define terms a little bit?
Well, capital is money that is used to make more money, or the other way I look at it is that it is the way in which social labor is appropriated by private persons. And therefore the accumulation of capital, to me, is what is central. So capital is not a thing, it's a process. It's a process of circulation of money making more money, and then that's appropriated by individuals. So one of the things I would want to do is to say the more and more of the economy we can take out of that circulation process, the better off we will be. Now, the trend over the last 30 or 40 years is to take everything from, you know, housing to education. I mean, take something like education. More and more it's become sort of integrated into the circulation of capital, where the result is that students are now living in indebtedness and the money kind of calculations drive universities, preschool and all the rest of it. And this is something which ought to be reversed and go in the other direction. In other words, we should have an education system that is decommodified, taken out of the commodity realm, taken out of the realm of the circulation of capital. And you look at healthcare, you look at education, you look at water, you look at basic utilities, you look at housing and so on. You say, there's a mission here. One of the things we can do is decommodify all of those things and start saying we can find a way of providing those socially without going through this business of some people getting extremely rich on playing in the housing market as they did in the housing before the housing market crashed in 2007.
But there are still going to be people who are investing and accumulating wealth. Do we need money that rots or decays or something so that you can't accumulate it?
I love this idea of oxidized money, you know, the money that disintegrates. I mean, and actually people have played around with this, and there are some systems that exist right now which do this.
I mean, people are experimenting with time banking and, I don't know, Bitcoin.
There's all sorts of banking discussions going on and with these kinds of questions in mind. That's what the experiments are useful in that respect. Yeah. But it's also important to know, you know, when I went to the University of Wisconsin, a state-owned university, it was what you're talking about. We paid $50 a month, $50 a year kind of tuition, or $90 a semester, something like that. It was provided as a public service, and it was not commodified.
Yeah, I got all the way through to my PhD, and it was all paid for.
Yeah, and that ought to be.
It was all free.
Yeah. So, and there are these elements in the system that can still be developed that way and need to be brought forward as the elements that become part and parcel of the next vision. So yes, that's what this is all about, building a system that actually decommodifies, changes the ownership and functions of capital, but does it in a way that's democratized and decentralized and humane, which has not been part of the actual experience in some parts of the world. So we've got to figure out how to make that real.
The other big issue where we're going to need something is around the question of growth. The problem.
Look, capitalism is a system that must grow. That's its name in order to the accumulation process continues. They also have to grow against the limits of, the ecological limits of the society and the resource limits of the globe, of the world. So the next system has got to deal with something that doesn't, by definition, have to grow. We're finding very interesting, very radical people, but also liberals and more moderate people say that really is a question because we've been so propagandized that there really is no alternative. Tina, Thatcher's idea.
I mean, there are a lot of movements around. I mean, I'll just give you one example. There are quite a few progressive mayors being elected and city councils being elected in the United States right now. And then you kind of say to yourself, well, let's think about what kind of alliance they might have together. And many of them are doing things like passing minimum wage ordinances and things like that, and trying to do something, supporting land trusts, trying to turn themselves into what we might call a partnership state with in relationship to social movement. So there is something going on there. Now, if I just say that, then I kind of say, okay, I don't think it's necessarily that progressive, but on the other hand, progressive forces could kind of really, I think, take that on and really change the world.
The crisis is severe enough that you cannot solve the problem the old way.
Right.
And in some parts of the country, people are being forced to experiment. And this is a time when the left needs to be both articulate, active, but also talking to Americans. They want to hear something new that makes sense rather than rhetoric. So I think it's a very important time.
But we've got to have a new way of doing politics.
Yep.
And I think it's a time for invention.
Yep.
And experimentation. And of course, experimentation means you often get things wrong. But we've got to go out there and I think really push.
And embrace that notion that there will be failure.
Yes.
Say that, you can't move forward without that. It's absolutely part of the process.
Right. David, Gar, go out. Make a mistake. Embrace it. What would a different economy look like? One example is the Workerowned cooperative. We spoke to worker owners from around the world to hear about their experiences in starting these cooperatives. Here's a little of what we heard.
Number one, we own a share of the business. We share out part of the surplus, the financial surplus that is made at the end of the year in good years. So each worker gets a slice of that pie.
At a time during the Great Recession where most people were losing jobs or being laid off, there's a lot of destabilization happening economically, we were actually growing and hiring people. And that caught the attention of local politicians.
It took basically almost a year between the conception of the idea to when we launched. At the beginning, we were meeting almost on a weekly basis. Mostly via conference calls, just because we have small babies. We still have small babies. We got our EIN number shortly after we started, and then we said, okay, this is official, and we're going to do this.
Aorta practices everyday democracy in a lot of ways. Being a co-owner of a small business is a really intimate thing. And so we, first of all, our organizational structure is that we're all equal. We function on a consensus basis. We share tasks and responsibilities to the greatest extent that makes sense. We also believe in specialization and support one another.
There were a couple issues that Union Cab faced when starting that, had they gone a different way, would have resulted in the failure of the enterprise. The first one was just raising enough capital. They couldn't just go get a bank loan because banks and credit unions don't recognize collective borrowers.
You can't start up a worker-owned cooperative with the idea that you're going to make money right now. You have to start up a worker-owned cooperative with a vision of 10, 15 years from now, what you want to leave.
One of the biggest challenges that a lot of cooperatives face is they haven't really spent enough time thinking through their business model, their business strategy. It's really understanding the revenue structure. How is it that you're going to make money? It's understanding the customers. What are the problems, what is the problem or the need that you need to solve for someone? Because you need to create value for someone else. in this business. And if it doesn't, then the business doesn't exist. It's not going to survive in the long run.
And even thinking through problems together of what kinds of, what kind of role are we playing in movement building as serving our purpose for building capacity for groups who are cooperatives or supporting the solidarity economy and working towards social justice.
I would say the biggest factor for success for a co-op during the start-off phase, it is rooted in this, the relationships of the founders and the understanding and agreement they have with each other and their level of education and training on, number one, how to run the business. So there's just purely the business thing that any business needs to be successful. But number two, the democratic processes and structures that they're going to need moving forward to make the co-op be a successful cooperative democratic business.
I'm somebody who does economic democracy. I'm somebody who does cooperatives, and I want to see cooperative development lift up communities throughout the Delaware Valley, throughout my region.
We moved from land ownership to home ownership, and it's time we move to workplace ownership.
I was in another form of a cooperative, but it wasn't my cooperative, and it was called sharecropping. I come from sharecroppers, and now I have my own company, and it feels so great. It feels so good.
I'm beginning to think the American left is a lot like Eeyore, the grumpy donkey in Winnie the Pooh. Our favorite food is thistles. Give us a week in which something truly extraordinary is won, and we cheer for an instant before returning to gloom. On June 2nd, Seattle's City Council unanimously approved a minimum wage hike to $15 an hour, more than double the federal minimum. The vote came amid a sea of dismal data showing how wage stagnation increases inequality and a chorus of righteous hand-wringing about the dire state of our democracy. Just 2 days after the vote in the council, researchers at the Economic Policy Institute, a progressive think tank, released yet another report showing how growing productivity has not shrunk national poverty because, well, the wages are too damn low. Thomas Piketty's been in the headlines for months with his book and his charts showing how in our finance-driven capitalist system, the rich keep getting richer and the poor poorer because when it comes to financial returns, Main Street simply can't compete with Wall Street. A new documentary about the Koch brothers is out there, describing what people and corporations with mega wealth can do to keep things this way. Ban unions, vilify poor people, trash talk government, then buy yourself a Congress and a court. That's supposed to do it. At the release of the EPI report in Washington, Larry Cohen, president of the Communications Workers of America, let rip. It's not going to matter what our policy ideas are, he said, if we don't build a working class democracy movement. This democracy is literally in the trash can. We keep pretending it's not, but it is. Well, a whole lot of people in Seattle haven't been pretending. They weren't happy with the stagnant $7.25 federal minimum, or with President Obama's proposed hike to $9. Despite the talk of falling skies and economic crises, they joined the call raised by fast food and Walmart workers for a $15 an hour wage, and with union support, they got $15 an hour on the ballot in the Seattle suburb of SeaTac last November. At the same time, Shama Sawant, a socialist challenger to a same old incumbent Democrat, made a citywide $15 an hour minimum wage the central focus of her campaign for a seat on the city council. She won, and SeaTac won, and within weeks of her taking office, Seattle's mayor and every single council member was voting in favor of the hike. They'd seen the polls. Audacious organizing turned the tide. As someone says, the law's not perfect. It doesn't come in fast enough, and it's flawed by corporate loopholes, but heck, it's a victory worth celebrating, isn't it? Keep chewing on your thistles if you like, but remember, Eeyore also had a fondness, as I recall, for pots you can bang on and red balloons. For more audacious interviews with organizers who are building the new economy right here, right now, check out our show. And thanks for watching. I'm Laura Flanders.